All right, if you recall, last episode or 2 episodes ago, we had Kamen Mohammadi, the Iranian journalist, talk to us about everything happening in Iran. Here to talk more about it because we want to spend more spotlight and attention on all the protests that are happening over there is Gissou Nia. She's a human rights attorney, the director of the Atlantic Council Strategic Litigation Project, and she's also a board member on the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center. She's going to tell us all about that. She joins us here on the Can We Please Talk podcast. Gissou, Mike Leon, Nick Saveri, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast with us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Gissou, full disclosure, and I mentioned this a couple episodes ago. One of my close family friends' nephew still lives in Iran, has been arrested in the protest. So this has been kind of a little bit personal to me. Don't know him, but I know what the family's going through right now, living over here abroad. I also have, a lot of friends that work in the immigration rights space here that are Iranian. So this is kind of warped into my world a little bit because I know what this feels like being a Cuban American and some of the issues that have happened in Cuba over the last year or so. For you, the question that I had right off the bat was, I saw a tweet that you posted recently about how many deaths we are inching closer to each day, how many confirmed deaths of people that are under the age of 18. There's been over 5,500 arrests, including 147 students and 36 journalists. Just at a 30,000 foot overview for you, because I know you are Iranian, like, how is all of this making you feel? How are you digesting all of this? What are some of your takeaways with all of the protests that have been happening over the last couple of weeks there in Iran?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Iranians who live abroad, who are in the diaspora, our bodies are not physically on the line in the street protesting for these basic human rights. And so the least we can do is show solidarity and try to make sure that the international community is at least not standing in the way of the protesters. There's so many things that the international community can do to show solidarity or to, in fact, prioritize the interests of the people of Iran over their corrupt and human rights violating leaders. And too often, the policy choices result in collective punishment for the people or are kind of focused on a containment policy that doesn't really serve the aspirations of the people.
You just mentioned a moment ago about media coverage. In your view, what are we, not even we, I guess the mainstream media, that's not really myself, but what do you experience as what is being mostly broadcast or being correct, but then also more importantly, what's being misrepresented or underrepresented in the coverage?
Well, yeah, you guys are not the mainstream media, and it would be completely unrealistic for a protester in Iran right now to come on and do a half hour or hour-long podcast. First of all, their internet has largely been slowed down or even completely disrupted in some areas. So how would they even join via video link? I mean, it's not going to happen, right? So, but in terms of general coverage, I think that the media is doing a way better job of being in touch with, what is actually being said on the ground and sort of amplifying voices and not sticking to just, some regular voices that maybe represent what's happening in Iran, but have their own specific lens. And a lot of times that's a very security focused lens. So over the years, the commentators that usually speak on Iran issues are commentators that talk about the ballistic missiles program or talk about Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran's military activities in the region, or talk about the Iran nuclear deal. These are all very security focused conversations. And in the past, some of those commentators have been asked to give perspective and insight on protest movements, but a protest movement like this, which is driven by social change, and at the core of it is about discontent over a social restriction that resulted in the tragic killing of a young, beautiful Kurdish girl who was allegedly wearing improper hijab. You have to bring people on, or media has to bring people on who have studied Iran's Islamic Penal Code, who understand the discriminatory legal framework in the country, who actually speak to protesters and have documented the violence, the violations that have been committed against them, not just in this spate of protests, but also in prior protests that we've seen since 2017. So studying youth movements in the country, all of that is very relevant too, but some of that was missing. I think the media is doing a better job of identifying experts who can speak to that and provide some of that context, and then also trying to amplify the actual voices inside Iran, which are really the voices that we need to be listening to.
Not having been to or grown up in Iran, in my experience of the nation, like most Americans, is our understanding of, earlier with a supreme leader in the 1980s, and Khomeini, come to find out, we have another Ayatollah that is still serving as supreme leader, not in the best of health, which is arguably a good thing. But back then, for me growing up, I was born in 78. The idea of a protest at this magnitude would have been unheard of. What's fueling just these young women and men as well to take to the streets? Most recently, there was footage of police officers that, rather trying to round up protesters, just marched alongside them, either because they saw the numbers or like we saw with Yugoslavia years ago, everyone's walking in the line with the same step of the realization that the government is just not for them anymore. In your view, what's different now? What's sparking this protest against the regime that historically we've seen has been oppressive in a generation ago as well?
I think one major thing is hypocrisy. So with the advent of social media and with images being readily shared on Instagram, a lot of Iranians are on Instagram. Of course, most of these social media services are censored or there's restrictions on them, but Iranians have VPNs to bypass that. And there is a very active Instagram culture. I would follow, lots of Iranian fashion bloggers and things like that who are blogging from Tehran. The thing is that on those networks, you can see there's been pages that have been dedicated to showing the lavish lifestyles of the children of the clerics and the children of the leadership. So while the fathers have been preaching this kind of pious Islamic, supposedly Islamic lifestyle, the reality is their children are, there's footage of them drinking alcohol, tattoos, showing lots of skin, wearing lots of makeup, basically dressing in a way that doesn't really comport with the preachings of their fathers. And so there's a major disconnect between what the leadership has been saying the population needs to do and what restrictions they need to live under and what their own children are doing. A lot of those children also live, work, study, and visit Western countries that the fathers have been denouncing as hotbeds of sin. So there's just a lot of hypocrisy, and the Iranian population has seen that, and the young population has seen that. So the revolution in 79 was really, meant to be something that would square class disconnects. There was a sense that there was a big stratification between the richer elite classes and the lower classes, or those who had less financial means. And so the fact that the middle to, folks in the middle to lower class are who is taking to the streets and dissenting is really significant, because those were the bedrock foundation of the revolution. And the revolution has not delivered clearly for them in the long term. And the children of the leadership are leading very flashy, lavish lifestyles that all can see.
Gissou, you mentioned a couple things there about Iran's penal code and some things that are in the legal space. So I want you to put on your legal hat for us here as a human rights lawyer, because I mentioned your tweet earlier that talked about how many people have been killed in these protests, how many arrests. 5,500 is a large swath, and that's just as of this taping. Journalists that have been arrested in this. We're hearing of kidnappings. We've seen videos that have been posted of women that have been beaten in the streets. From a legal standpoint, your estimation, is there anything that can be done on the international court level for some of these crimes and atrocities that are being committed against citizens?
Yeah, it's really complicated. Without getting into too many too into the weeds for the audience. Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran is not a member of the International Criminal Court. So it falls outside of the jurisdiction of the court. I should note the United States is not a member of the court either, nor is Russia, nor is China. So, but with Iran, there's been different attempts, including by myself, to ensure that there isn't impunity for certain crimes, but typically there would have to be some sort of cross-border element, or there'd have to be another creative jurisdictional pathways. So, I could successfully bring submissions that look, or not successfully, but like bring submissions that jurisdictionally are sound if they're looking at crimes committed by Islamic Republic of Iran officials in the territory, in the Syrian conflict that were completed in the territory of Jordan, which is a member of the ICC. Or recently, last month, my co-counsel and I brought a submission for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' downing of a civilian aircraft over Tehran skies, but back in January 2020, but that was on board a Ukrainian registered aircraft. And because Ukraine has given made a declaration of jurisdiction to the International Criminal Court, it falls under the jurisdiction of the court. But these are creative jurisdictional pathways. So currently there's no international criminal court that has jurisdiction to look at this unless the UN Security Council were to refer the matter, for instance, which will not happen because Russia's on the UN Security Council and so is China, and they're not going to be inclined to do such a thing. The other ways that there can be jurisdiction are through national courts. So national courts, some of them have what we call universal jurisdiction frameworks, which means that there does not need to be any territorial or nationality link to the country in which the matter is being adjudicated. So a lot of folks may have seen that trials involving, alleged perpetrators from the Syrian conflict have happened in German courts, despite the perpetrators being Syrian, the victims being Syrian, and the crimes having occurred in the territory of Syria. War crimes, crimes against humanity, all of that can be prosecuted. It's these crimes that countries have determined are so terrible and so horrible that one needs to be able to prosecute them anywhere. So that is more of what we would look to in terms of, in the international community being able to adjudicate these matters. But what I hope in the future is that the judiciary in Iran will one day be independent in a future Iran where a lot of these trials against perpetrators who are committing these violations right now would be able to happen in domestic courts, which is why it's so important to preserve and collect evidence of the atrocities now, because we want to preserve that for future accountability processes.
Quick break here. We are presented as always by Fresh Roasted Coffee. If you can see my screen here. Fresh Roasted Coffee since 2009, this Pennsylvania company has been delivering fresh roasted coffee. You can check out their website at freshroastedcoffee.com or shop them online through a bunch of different places. I'm gonna read you something here. Nick, they roast the freshest coffee beans using the most eco-friendly roasting technology on earth. I happen to have a cup right here, fresh roasted coffee. I always record with it. Nick, why don't you tell the people, you're a coffee snob, why don't you tell the people why they should head on down to freshroastedcoffee.com and buy some of this amazing coffee?
First, Mike, let's talk about flavors. If you are a single origin kind of person like you and myself, they've got you. If you are a flavor person, they've got you as well. Flavor packs, individual items as well. And it's not just coffee, folks. You can also get tea. My wife's a tea drinker, so freshroastedcoffee.com's got her too. But more importantly, you can learn about the coffee. When you get to the website, there's a quiz that tells you what's the coffee that's best for you. Sumatra is my blend, and they got that one right. I can tell you that for sure. They'll do the same for you when you head over to the website.
freshroastedcoffee.com. Go to our episode description right now. There's a link right there, and at checkout, you're going to get a discount for this amazing tasting coffee. Head to freshroastedcoffee.com today. And now back to the show. I want to give space to you, for you right now to, we were talking about in your introduction, the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center. And obviously, we know you work at the Strategic Litigation Project. Can you explain a little bit of what both of those orgs are doing to either help right now, what's happening in Iran, or recent things that have happened in Iran?
Yeah, so I run the Strategic Litigation Project at the Atlantic Council. It's a project that I founded, like basically developed in 2019. So we're kind of young. We've only been around for 3 years. But the idea is really that there are laws around the world that can provide accountability for atrocity crimes and human rights violations that can be hard to come by in some countries' domestic courts. So a situation very much like Iran. We don't only work on Iran, we also work on Syria, we work on Venezuela, we work on issues affecting the Uyghurs in China, we work on Ukraine and Belarus. So you might see a pattern. It tends to deal with countries where either they're being subjected to terrible atrocity crimes, and they have the jurisdiction, domestically to do something, or those countries where that pathway is not really there. And so you're going to need to look to international remedies for such a matter. The idea was really that we could maybe strengthen some of this legal framework or introduce new laws that would allow litigators to be able to bring these cases forward. Iran is a big part of the work because of my personal background and because I've been working on Iran human rights issues for more than a decade. And so the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center, where I'm board chair, I used to be executive director of that group for a few years. And the mission of that group, which has been around since 2004, so it'll be 20 years in about 2 years from now, is really to document human rights violations in Iran and keep that record. And again, it was with this view towards accountability that, maybe in the present, we don't have the ability to bring these cases, but maybe in the future we can. And I can say that we've already had a turn towards accountability. So years ago, it would have been inconceivable, or not inconceivable, but there were no trials against representatives of the Islamic Republic of Iran for core international crimes. And now this past July, a Swedish district court convicted a man named Hamid Nouri for atrocity crimes that he committed in 1988 in Iran's jails when he was responsible for killing thousands of Iranian political prisoners in what is considered to be summary execution. So that was a historical case, but it was a very important case. It was the first ever universal jurisdiction trial against an alleged perpetrator from the Islamic Republic of Iran. And if a lot of mid to lower level perpetrators start leaving the country in a time of uncertainty, they may end up in places where they have visas, like France, Germany, Sweden, the Netherlands, and all those countries have universal jurisdiction frameworks.
It's just pivoting to another, when we think about from the international community standpoint, our reaction to Iran, similar as we would have with Russia and other nations, sanctions often comes up. You've shared via Twitter just where you stand, with sanctions and not necessarily in being in support. Just take us through a little bit of just your viewpoint on sanctions, but in general, what would make sense for the international community's best response to be most effective one in supporting the protesters and the citizens of Iran?
Sanctions are a really charged and loaded word because also I think there's a lack of distinction between different types of sanctions and what it means. So I am against broad-based economic sanctions. I always have been, and I'm against it in pretty much every context. I think we were talking about Cuba. Clearly, broad-based economic sanctions have not really delivered change, have they, after decades of such a policy? So I actually think it's lazy policy. It's sort of like an easy, quote unquote, easy thing for the US government to do, but it results in very little real world change, in my opinion. I haven't seen a lot of great examples of where it's worked. A lot of people point to apartheid South Africa as an example. That's great, but look, it's been applied in multiple other contexts where it clearly hasn't yielded the results it needs to. I would distinguish that from targeted human rights sanctions. That means asset freezes or travel bans on those that are responsible for human rights violations in a regime. And the idea is to modify behavior, to incentivize them to change if they feel like their money might be taken away from them, or they may lose the ability to go holiday in Switzerland. Now, that might have a really, we'll see how it goes. That might have more of an impact on a Russian oligarch, let's say, who's used to holidaying in Monaco or something like this. But when it comes to Islamic Republic of Iran officials, the picture is a bit more complicated because it's really the children that actually are the weak point, because they're the ones that are going to North America and Europe and kind of living this very disconnected from their parents' lifestyle that's very lavish and kind of going and coming and all this. And then the parents themselves, I mean, I'm a big proponent of not only freezing assets, but in their cases, because they're chronic human rights violators, actually seizing the assets and transferring it from perpetrators to victims. That's a bit more of a, that's taking it a bit farther than what targeted sanctions tools are normally intended to do. They're normally intended to be behavior modification tools. If you're actually seizing and repurposing assets, that's more of an accountability tool. But we did see this happen in the Russia-Ukraine context, where the oligarch assets were, they haven't all been successfully litigated to be able to be liquidated, but they were seized to basically fund Ukraine's reconstruction. And Canada is the first country to pass legislation that allows for such a repurposing. And I think that they need to put it to a test case and use that legislation to repurpose the assets of plenty of IRGC linked individuals within their own borders that people have, drawn attention to. So that's what I think needs to happen. And that's different from broad-based economic sanctions. With broad-based economic sanctions, especially when it's enacted over a long time, you'll see like rising inflation in a country. No doubt a lot of Iran's economic problems are due to mismanagement and corruption, of course, but there's no denying that US sanctions have played a role, and that just results in the middle class getting squeezed. And a lot of times the elites actually profit off a black market that arises as a result of that. So I think we need to get more surgical. And by we, I mean the international community needs to get more surgical with how they approach, really targeting those that are responsible for repression in a country and are acting in contravention of international conventions and laws.
Gissou, before we let you go, I wanted to read something that a listener wrote into us that had a question, and I thought it was so relevant to bring that up here for you to answer, given all of your background and work and perspective on this. This movement, I'm paraphrasing now what they wrote, but this movement seems on the surface to be very grassroots, where there's no figurehead, there's no real leader. With that being said, what do you think is the end goal? Because if it's toppling the government, then what? Who takes over? Who fills that vacuum? Look at the instability in the region. What are some of your thoughts on that right now, as the movement does seem very grassroots, again, as to an outside observer here. But what is the end game here? Because we've seen different instances where protesters and in different time periods, I think back in 2009 as well, where these unfortunately have not been successful. What do you make of all of this and the end game?
Yeah, so the protests in June 2009 were very much about reform in the system, because the slogan at that time was, "Where is my vote?" So it was about a disputed presidential election. And it was actually making an institutional plea, really, like, why were our votes not properly counted? The slogans now are death to the Islamic Republic, death to the dictator. They're not wondering where their votes are. They don't really think their votes mean anything. And again, the head of state, the supreme leader, is not voted in. He is, unelected and accountable to no one. That's referring to the presidential election, which is really more like a selection, because the candidates are so heavily vetted. The president doesn't have any real power when compared to the supreme leader, who's the ultimate decision maker. But, it's really up to the people of Iran to tell us what they want. It would be very easy for me to say there should be a free and fair election. There should, just the basics. There should be a referendum on the Islamic Republic to see if they should still even be in power. But it's really up to the people to tell us what they want. And we, as the international community, just, I think, need to not stand in the way of that by rewarding their oppressors or making deals that will ensure that any kind of grassroots movement to demand change is sort of snuffed out. I think there's ways to amplify and elevate what they're calling for without getting into all these questions. It's really up to them to determine their future, and they are the future. The people of Iran are overwhelmingly young, and their leadership right now is at the age of 70 and above. Like, these young people don't have any memory of the 1979 revolution. They weren't even alive, So I think it's just really important that we listen to them and make sure that there's solidarity and support for the people, just as I would say for oppressed people anywhere who are demanding a change.
Gissou, I can't thank you enough for coming on the program. Like I mentioned, she's a human rights attorney. You can follow her on social media, on Twitter or on Instagram. She's also a board member on the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center and a director of the Atlantic Council Strategic Litigation Project. Gissou, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast with us. Continued success to you, and please stay safe.
Okay, thank you for having me.
Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do him a favor. So hit subscribe.